It hasn't actually been that long since we talked about hunter builds, but a lot of things have changed. Ahoy, my name is SLOTH, and today we'll be looking into the current hunter builds with a heavy focus on what's currently going on in the Pro League. So in a sense, this is what we can learn from the pros, only that we're focusing on hunter specifically. The first thing I want to show you here to just give you a bit of an idea is this overview by Dark Humor on Reddit, who posted all the items and how much they were bought during this week. And there are obviously a few that stand out that essentially make the foundation. The first one is Bluestone Pendant as the starter, which has been bought by 62% of the players, or in 62% of the matches rather. Then there is Ninja Tabai with 85%, Transcendence with 86%, and Asi with 83%. But even if we leave out the Mage Hunter items, beyond that we still have a surprising amount of variety. There are some items like Poison Star and Berserker's Shield that have really low percentages. This is because they were only bought when being swapped out for boots. But overall, there's still interesting item path being chosen by the pros. And to make a little bit more sense of that, we need to look into the actual games. Let's begin by talking about the two most standard builds. That always starts with Bluestone Pendant, then there's Transcendence, Ninja Tabai after that, then Asi, then Executioner, and from there you go into Sais, and then usually you'll see the hunter switching out the Bluestone for Odysseus Bow. This is a typical pen focused build with the percentage damage from kins as well as a lot of attack speed. The alternative starts the same way, Bluestone, Transcendence, Ninja Tabai, Asi, Executioner, but afterwards you go into crit. Usually the next item here is either Rage or Wind Demon, and then Bluestone is traded out for either Wind Demon or Deathbringer. Sometimes Wind Demon is actually built in place of Bluestone before the secondary crit item. What we can establish at this point is that with Gilded Arrow not being preferred by hunter players anymore, we'll get to that part a little bit later, we see a bit of a return to Sais generally, but crit also isn't dead. We still see a lot of crit, especially because Wind Demon is such a strong item and it just combines well with other crit items. So it's not really like they're reliant on Ornate Arrow to make the crit builds work. Before we get a little bit deeper into the unusual builds, I want to talk a little bit about the item changes that made this happen, because it's actually really interesting. The first thing that happened is that Gilded Arrow got a nerf, and Ornate Arrow got a nerf along with it, purely to its gold gain. But because of that alone, the carry playing pros don't consider it worth picking up anymore. Mainly because it doesn't fast pass you to 3000 gold anymore. In the same breath, Executioner got a nerf of 5% attack speed reduction, but completely kept the same popularity as before. I find this a little bit surprising. I would have thought that we would see some dominance by now, but dominance obviously doesn't work very well with concise builds, and that's the issue here. You don't have the same flexibility of choosing your build later, you're kind of forced into crit or you're going to sacrifice some damage, which is not the case with Transcendence. Along with that, Asi got a buff of 5 power. I actually didn't expect this buff to be sufficient to make Asi meta again. It most certainly makes the item stronger and more interesting, but I thought Asi's main problem was the high price tag, which is still kept. Also, the Transcendence buff that decreased its price from 2600 to 2450 was actually not established on the previous patch yet all hunter players opted into Transcendence and completely left Devourer's Gauntlet behind. At the same time, we obviously see the very interesting shift to Bluestone Pendant. Bluestone Pendant actually got a nerf before it got popular on hunters, with the HP 5 being reduced from 20 to 10, so that was definitely a good thing. However, it also got a 5 power buff at the same time as Ornate Arrow got its buff. And this 5 power buff is arguably more relevant for hunters. I actually play a few Bluestone Hunter games earlier in the season before this buff, and the power being relatively low on it compared to other starters always felt like an issue, and also at the time it couldn't really compete with Death Tall. That has since been nerfed as well, so now Bluestone is in a much better position to actually allow you to play aggressively in duo lane, while still providing you with at least a little bit of sustain. And this is very interesting, right? When I talked about other build options like Angel's Transcendence build, Dominance build, and all that stuff, the main argument against it was always, it doesn't provide sustain, you're not really getting through early, yet now we are seeing very aggressive builds that don't really focus on sustain. They purely rely on the 10 HP 5 from Bluestone Pendant for sustain, and outside of that you are building Transcendence, you're building Ninja Tabai, and you're only really getting more sustain once Asi is completely built. So you can imagine what other shift this causes. The gods that utilize these items better get higher in the meta. The primary example here is, you guessed it, Chiron, who has been favored by pretty much any pro as of late. Chiron comes with a lot of bully potential, a lot of aggression, has a lot of abilities to proc Bluestone consistently both for poking and clearing, and he also comes with built-in sustain. So he's the ideal user for a build like this, and also benefits from the MP5 by the way, so he can spam his abilities more. And at the same time, he also benefits from his own buffs, recently having received knock-up immunity / knockback immunity on his dash, which makes him a relatively safe character in combination with his cleanse. But he's not the only one. Danzaburo also saw a decent amount of play, also a character that can use mana for at least a little bit of healing with his 2. Medusa most certainly gained popularity, who just works very well with early aggression and with power-heavy builds. And then we saw some Anhur, same case here, as well as quite a few Heimdall picks. There are 3 other gods that were played, Apollo, Chernobog and Neith, but we'll have to get to those a little bit later. So essentially what happened is the entire meta got overhauled because Asi got a 5 power buff, even though Executioner got a nerf, and because there was a Transcendence buff on the horizon that is now in the game. So the build is even better now. But is that really all that is being built on Hunters? No, there are actually some very interesting variations of this build on some gods in some roles. The first one we need to talk about here is Zeros. Zeros likes playing Hunters in middle lane, often accompanied by a magical carry. And he played Neith in middle lane with Gilded Arrow, Devourer's Gauntlet, Ninja Tabai, Executioner, Wind Demon and Deathbringer. And he did the same thing with Chernobog. And he did the same thing in the previous week as well. And I think this is very interesting. Obviously, there's always a bit of a hive mind mentality going on when it comes to builds. If you play against a build and the build does better against you, then you're likely to switch over to that. But Zeros seems to still value the previous build more, for mid lane specifically. Part of this is likely because he is not facing another hunter that is running the Bluestone build. So he doesn't have to worry about the same level of early pressure. He's playing against a mage that plays differently anyways. And as such, he can focus more on his late game farm. Unfortunately, until his whole team finally gets to America and they can actually play on normal ping, it's going to be relatively hard to tell what the whole situation for them is and how good these tactics really work. But he still wins games with this. Yakor ran a variation on Chiron, where he didn't build Executioner, but built Sais in that slot instead, and then went into Titan's Bane. I thought this was also interesting, especially because for Chiron this can be quite a massive damage boost on his abilities, and I'm a little bit surprised that seemingly no one else is trying this. Yakor has built this multiple times and won multiple games with it, so there must be something to it. He swaps out Bluestone for Odysseus' bow at the end as well, so you get some more attack speed from that anyways. Imolito ran a build on Apollo that was Leather Cowl, Transcendence, Ninja Tabai, Asi, Wind Demon and Deathbringer. So he basically had no percentage pen outside of the 10% that you get from a Wind Demon proc. That said, there was a Nemesis on this team, so there was a lot of protection reduction in another place, which can kind of offset that, but still makes it kind of hard if you're going against multiple tanky enemies. When Netroid played Heimdall, he ran the typical build that I described, but he ran it with Death Toll instead of Bluestone. He then later traded that for Odysseus' bow instead of upgrading it. Dardis also did a Neith mid pick, building Bluestone into Transcendence and Ninja Tower at the start, but then going into Brawler's Beatstick, and then Titan's Bane, which was a very interesting combination. After that, he switched out his Bluestone for Odysseus' bow, and then built Sais. My guess is that the goal here was to really maximize the damage of the snipes, while also having access to anti-heal, with Asi not being as important in mid lane anyways, especially if you're playing Neith and you get sustain in other ways, and your opponent not sustaining as much. In one of the longest matches that we had here, Vote played Apollo and started the game with Death Toll. He then built Transcendence and Ninja Tabai and Asi Executioner, and went into Wind Demon and upgraded Death Toll to Death Embrace. He then sold his boots for Deathbringer, but because the game was going on so long, he eventually ended up selling Death Embrace as well and getting Sais instead. On the other team, Panacat, who was playing Chiron, built the standard Sais build, and then in late game he kept Bluestone Pendant and upgraded it to Bluestone Brooch. He kept that for a while, traded out his boots for Oboe, but eventually traded out Bluestone Brooch for Titan's Bane as well. Interestingly enough, this was one of the few games where PandaCat was really struggling to make an impact damage-wise. Both of the hunters were not performing particularly well, but this was a really rough one for Panda, even though he had essentially the meta build. In the next game, Vote was playing Anhur and was playing the Kins build essentially, but built Odysseus Bow in the place of Kins and upgraded Bluestone Pendant to Bluestone Brooch. Then eventually, however, he traded that out anyways and went into Sais. So it seems like some of the Hunter players really value the starter upgrades, while most of them prefer to just trade out Bluestone for something else. And then we also had Emilito and Anhur with what was probably the most chaotic Hunter build of them all. He started with Death Toll, and then went into Bloodforge, Ninja Tabai, Ekival, and Sais. Now to me this build actually seems like a response to the meta build. Between Death Toll and Bloodforge you have a decent amount of sustain, and you also have a relatively okay early power spike through Bloodforge without needing any stacks or anything, in return for it being a little more expensive. And then once you've withstood the early pressure from Bluestone, you essentially completely floor it by going into Ekival and just continue this hyper aggressive build with Kins for even more boxing potential. So your boxing potential overall should be pretty insane, especially on a character like Anhur. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough in this match, but I kinda hope that we see it again just to see if it actually stands a chance. Oh, and Cyclone Spin also had a very interesting build on Anhur. He built him with Leather Cowl, then built Transcendence and Ninja Tabai and didn't build Asi, but instead relied on the sustain from Leather Cowl, built Wind Demon, then upgraded Leathered Cowl into Hunter's Cowl, and then built Shadow Steel Shuriken. I'm honestly not entirely sure why this was his choice here. The enemy team had a fair bit of sustain, but not something crazy. Maybe just wanted a quick cheap crit item to advance his build, I don't know. But definitely another interesting build path. So while it may look like there are only two possible paths that are relatively comparable DPS wise, one obviously relying more on Odysseus Bow, the other one relying on the RNG from crit, there is actually a fair bit more to it, and there are still quite a few other builds going around, and we probably have more variety than we had previously in Hunter builds overall, which I think is a good thing. We'll see if Hi-Rez changes something about Transcendence now to maybe increase the variety there a little bit, but knowing Hunters, they usually establish either Transcendence or Devourer's Gauntlet as the primary choice, and then usually you'll hardly see anything else being built. I think partially that is just the nature of DPS focused builds. We'll have some more to talk about when it comes to learning from the pros very soon, so if you want to see that, click like and subscribe, or I will tell you the story of how this outro actually came to be. You've heard the last part of it yesterday, and I wanted to solve the mystery. There wasn't really much to it, to be honest. I just wanted to have a different outro, and I figured one where I add an additional word every single day would be fun. It would drag out for a while, and eventually the whole sentence would be revealed. So I wrote down the whole sentence and then just always read a little bit more of it. But the funny thing is that during this time I actually started thinking, if I talk about my home gym and staring at it and contemplating if it's harder for me to work out, then I should actually try that. I should actually try and regularly work out and find the time for it, find the motivation for it, and that's what I've been doing. So in a way, my own sentence guilt-tripped me into being more consistent with that. So I guess the conclusion is that it's actually easier for me to find the time to work out than it is for a lot of people to find the like button. If you're not one of those, feel free to click it now. Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That's That Nick Walker, Grain Brennan, Lenta25 Green, Zelaria, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawes, Angel, Z Ferroli, and everyone else you see here.